This is Brett Snodgrass with the Iron Deep Podcast, and today I have Chris Bruno, who's the author of Sage, A Man's Guide into a Second Passage. This is an awesome interview for men entering in to the second part of their life. Let's go. What's going on? This is Brett Snodgrass with another episode of the Iron Deep Podcast. I have author, counselor Chris Bruno on this podcast episode with me. What's going on, Chris?
Hey, it's so great to be here with you this morning, Brett. Great to meet you and great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no problem, man. We got a chance to catch up a little bit. I've heard about Chris just through his books. Number one, I read one of his first books called The Man Maker Project, A Father's Guide into Initiating His Son into Manhood. Must read book if you guys, especially if you have sons and they're reaching that certain point in their teenage years, want to initiate them into manhood. And you have a new book, Chris, Sage, which again speaks to me and it speaks to a lot of our audience. Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. So we're talking about men that are in maybe mid-30s, 40s, 50s, into that second part of life. And you're also the CEO of Restoration Project and the CEO of Restory Counseling. You're a counselor. And really, when I think about you, you have spent years just helping men recover their hearts. Is that a pretty good description of what you've been doing?
I love that phrase, recover your heart. I just think that is what this journey of our life is all about. So yes, love it.
Definitely. Before we just dive into this new book, Sage, A Man's Guide into a Second Passage, why don't you just talk about yourself, Chris, and talk about Restoration Project as well?
Yeah, sure. So I like to start just introductions based on the relationships that I have. So I live in Northern Colorado. I have been married for almost 28 years, and we have 3 mostly adult children. Our youngest is 17, our middle is 20, our oldest is 23. So we are almost empty nesters at this point. We got 1 year left. And my wife, Beth, and I, we met and married in college and then spent a good chunk of years, almost a decade, living overseas and doing missions work overseas. And then we landed back in the States, and that's when we launched Restoration Project and Restory Counseling. So Restoration Project is a ministry focused on, just like you said, helping men recover their hearts. Our vision is to see a world of restored men, and we are constantly looking for ways to help guys engage in areas of fatherhood, of brotherhood, and also in understanding ourselves as the sons of God. So fatherhood, brotherhood, and sonship. And each man, regardless of his, whether he has children, he is a father. He's designed to bring father energy to the world. And whether or not he has siblings, he is designed by God to be a brother. And then, of course, all of us are sons as well. So that's kind of the scope of the work that we're doing. And we provide resources and experiences for guys in any of those places along the journey.
That's awesome. So you've been literally just pouring into men for many years now. Obviously, men somewhere along their journey, somewhere along their way, sometimes they lose their way. Maybe they lose heart, and that's exactly what you do. You help guys find that again. So can you tell us about just maybe your own experience in that? Have you had your own experience where you've had this revelation, this emptiness, this lost soul? I think even in your new book, this tremor in your soul, right? Do you have your own experience with that?
Absolutely. And honestly, all the spaces that I live, I'm constantly just trying to live out loud. So just share what's happening to the world outside, what's happening on the inside. And so for me, this is a while ago, but back when I was in my late 20s and we had our first child, I had a little bit of a kind of oh crap moment where I realized, as I'm holding my son, who's now 23 years old, when I was first holding him, it was like, I know that I didn't get what I needed as a man from the men further along in the journey than me, my grandfathers, my father. And so I don't know that I have inside of me what I want to actually offer him. So I needed to do some work there. That was when I was, late 20s. And then over the course of, his growing up years, and we were overseas doing Christian ministry, and there were a lot of younger men who were just graduating out of college, launching out into life. It was kind of their first step into adulthood, and they were landing on my teams, and they were asking some of those very same questions. And I was, just 5, 6, 7, 10 years older than them. And I didn't know that I had the answers. And so for me, there was a sense of like, I don't know this journey either. And that really is where it's like, I need to step in and figure this out and really be intentional about my own healing and process and journey so that I am a full and wholly, mostly recovered man. And then I can also work with other guys to recover their hearts. And I say that because it's just it's a lifelong journey. We're never done. I think we would all say that, but I just knew that it had to start with me.
Yeah. And I could definitely tell just like your series of books seems like you are living out your seasons of life. You wrote The Man Maker Project, talking about your own experience with your own son. You have the Brotherhood primer book, and you talk even in this new book, Sage, about your own brotherhood relationships, how those strong bonds have shaped you. And then now you're entering into this second passage of life, and that's why you wrote the book, I believe, Sage. So let's just talk about this. So you wrote this book, Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. So let's just talk about that word. Number one, like I read Sage, and if I don't read the second part, I'm like, what? What does that mean? Like, I don't know.
What is it?
Yeah. What are we talking about here? So can you talk about, your experience with what is Sage?
For sure. So let me just focus first on that word passage. Okay. Because Man Maker Project is about the first passage of a man's life when he transitions from boy into man. Sage is about the second passage of a man's life when he transitions from man into sage. Now, we as a kind of Western culture and society, we don't do well in either of these passages. Mm-hmm. We don't focus well with a lot of intention and clarity and plan on what does it look like to raise our boys into men. But then we have a little bit more in that category, but very, very little in the sense of like, what does it mean to go from man into sage? For the most part, it just means us kind of growing and getting older. And so some people call it the second half. So it's like the second half of your life. And when you hit that 35, 45, 55-year-old range, it's like you come to grips with the reality of like, oh, a good portion of my life is behind me. Mm-hmm. And I need to really be intentional about how I'm going to invest the next season of my life. And so that's what I mean by passage, and the first passage and the second passage. But then the word sage is, again, not, if you're just going to like search Amazon for sage or whatever, you're probably going to come up with an herb.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, it's funny. I was getting ready to do this interview, and I was looking at my own cabinet and all my spices, and I saw sage. I was like, huh, there you go.
So it's not a really commonly used word with regard to a person. But another word for that is elder. And when we think about an elder, a couple of things come to mind. One is like the role or the position of a person in a church congregation, right? Mm-hmm. This is an elder. You're on the elder board. There's responsibilities that you have. There's a role that you have, a pastoral role. You become an elder. And then the other word that comes to mind is elderly. So we become elderly. And in my mind, that there's a huge difference between being an elder and being elderly. Mm. So when I use the word sage, I'm not meaning a role or responsibility like in church. And I'm also not meaning someone who's just old, elderly. I'm meaning someone who's stepping into the role of being what I call like the pylons of society. These older, wiser, experienced, settled people, and men and women both can be sages, but they step into this space of like offering more than offering what they do. They bring their presence. They bring the strength of their presence, and that is a sage. And in the book I talk about this a little bit, but behind every hero is another hero that's often unspoken, and that other hero is a sage. So in our modern day stories and all that, behind every Frodo is a Gandalf, behind every Luke is a Yoda, behind every Harry Potter is a Dumbledore. There's that sage type person. And the hero of the story, the Harry Potter, wouldn't be Harry Potter without Dumbledore.
Mm.
He actually is an important, probably the most important person in the journey of becoming that younger hero, is that guide, that elder, that sage.
Mm.
And I feel like if we do poorly in the rites of passage for boys becoming men, which we could spend a whole podcast talking about that, we really do poorly in men becoming sages. And I feel like just this sense of like, we graduate into manhood and then we just assume that manhood just continues on and on and on and on and on until we pass away. And the reality is there is another stage, there is another season that we need to intentionally pass through, and live into. And in my mind, both sociologically and biblically, it is actually the pinnacle of manhood. Not the king, not the hero, not the warrior. That's good. That's a huge, important part of a man's life. But the sage is actually what we're aiming for.
Mm.
The sage is actually where we want to land. And really, the highest level of our impact in the world comes from the season of sage.
Wow. Wow. No, I love how you just unraveled that. That's amazing. I mean, it made me want to really just to step into that. I'm 43. I think you're a little bit
50.
50,
Yep, I'm
50,
50.
just turned 50. Yeah. So, and just wanting to step into that. But you talked about our Western culture, men don't step into that. Instead, they maybe go a different direction. Maybe they've said, I've done my time. I've done the work I'm supposed to do. Now I'm going to rest or become old or work on their golf swing or
Yeah.
whatever that is, go collect some seashells in retirement. And they don't step into that. Right. And is that what you're seeing? And why, what is stopping? Is it just the training? Is it just the awareness that they don't know how to, they didn't get trained before? And can you talk to us about that a little bit? Like where are
Sure.
men losing that in this season? Because I see it a lot too.
Well, there's so many directions that I could go in answering that question. So first, I just want to say, like, I feel like we have an epidemic of masculine absence.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is we don't have these rites of passages for boys to become men, because by and large, a lot of us men are absent in their lives in that kind of intentional way. And then what you just described is like, I have nothing against retirement and golf and seashells, but I think it's like this graduating into a different kind of masculine absence, where our presence is the most important thing that we can bring to the world, more than what we do, more than what we provide, more than, our legacy is not the inheritance in the sense of financial. The legacy that we leave, the inheritance that we leave, is the impact of our presence. And that occurs when we have kids at home and we're trying to raise them up and grow them and father them. But then at the same time, it is in this sage space, this sage season of life, our presence is necessary. Now, presence doesn't mean you have to go start another company, conquer another hill, do another ministry, do all that kind of stuff. It's actually, you could play plenty of golf in the season of sage, but it's how are you investing yourself? How are you investing your presence with your community and other people? And it doesn't mean you're bringing advice. I think, I joke about this all the time. Like, in our day and age, like, I do not ask another man for advice. YouTube is far more helpful at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. Because I actually like hone in. I have 2 or 3 minutes. I can skim and it can just look at, what do I do with XYZ, the mortgage, the car, the whatever it is that I'm looking for advice on. But man, I need presence. I need an older man to sit with me and to be with me and just to listen and to have enough of his own self settled and present so that I can kind of come unraveled. And I've needed that over the course of my life. That, I think, guys, is what I'm talking about here, that season of sage. So I have nothing against a golf swing, but I just also don't want guys to disappear and continue in this epidemic of masculine absence.
Yeah. I just love when you talk about, yeah, just the presence, because again, like we have so much information, right? And if we want to learn something and get learn how to do something, like for example, I was listening, I wanted to see how do I cut out caffeine in my life. So if I seem a little like off today, it's because today's my first day where I'm not drinking caffeine, and I'm trying to cut that out, but I looked up podcasts, looked up YouTube, and just try to figure that out. And I can do that and find the information on that, but it's the presence. It's men need other men in their life. That's why Iron Deep was born, Restoration Project. We need other men in our life. So I want to talk about like maybe your own experience. Go into a story of yourself. Was there a sage in your life? And can you describe your experience with that? What was that like? Like, what can you take us into that story of like what does that even look like? Someone in your own life that you would say that was a sage in my life.
That was a sage. Yes. Well, I talk about this man in the book a little bit. His name is Ben. So I grew up in the mountains here of Colorado, and we were pretty remote, and school was like a 45-minute drive away, and so there it was a challenge for me to get actual that presence contact with many people in general. But the family context that I grew up in was it's my older sister and me, the only two of us in our family. And my older sister has pretty severe mental and physical disabilities, and she was born with them. So she's still alive today. She's about 5 years older than I am, but she operates at maybe about a 1-year-old level. She cannot care for herself. She can walk and talk, but that was even a journey. But she can't really hold conversation very well. So that was the context into which I was born. And now, go back 50 years when I was born, and our world did not do well with services for people with these kinds of disabilities. And so my sister was at home, and much of my mom and my dad's focus was on providing for her needs. And I often found myself kind of in this vacuous, empty landscape of just my own self, my own soul, and all that. My dad he's a very loyal man, and he was very present in the sense of making provision for us. But he did a far more in kind of focusing on providing for her needs than being aware of who I was as a boy. And so fast forward, I'm a teenager and I'm in high school, and I don't have the kind of relationship with my dad to have any kinds of conversations about that really significant season of a boy's life. He really needs kind of that testing ground, that tending ground, someone to listen and speak in. So this man, Ben, was kind of a youth group leader, young life leader that I met and was engaged and involved with. He himself was older, not your typical like 22-year-old young life leader. He was already in his 40s at that point. And I remember going to Ben's house, and we would go for like youth group time, but I would specifically go about an hour early, and he knew that I would be there. And I would stop at 7-Eleven and get one of their fancy dancy gourmet coffees from 7-Eleven and like bring it up to him. And we would walk out to the outside. He, of course, also lived in the mountains, and we would walk out to this split rail fence that he had back behind his house. And I just remember each of us kind of leaning on the fence, both of us having coffee in hand, not drinking it because it was so bad, but just like having a coffee in hand. And, each of us having kind of a leg up on the lower rail and just talking. And here's the thing is, I don't remember him talking. I remember me doing a lot of talking. And I remember him looking at me with intention. And I had both his attention and his intention. I had his questions. I had his compassion. And I was all over the map. I was all over the map with trying to figure out like girls and trying to figure out life and where am I going to go to college and how do I handle this emotionally vacuous family that I was growing up in and all those things. And Ben just brought his presence. And I can honestly say that if it wasn't for Ben, I don't think I would have made it through high school and into college and then even had a sense that I wanted to be. He really gave me like, I want to be like Ben. That's the man that I want to be like.
Wow.
And I'm still aiming to be like Ben. But that's probably my first experience of that kind of sage.
Mm. Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, when I was reading this book too, I think the audience too, they can just start picturing like, was there someone in your life
Yeah.
that did that? I remember there was a gentleman I talk about him in the past named Gary in college, and I was going through a very dark time, and he met with me my senior year and knew that I was just I was on the basketball team, and he came to the basketball games, and he just could see that I was having a difficult time and overheard some people talking about me going through this difficult time, and then he met with me for coffee every single week my senior year. Just yeah, and just kind of his presence. I don't even remember what we talked about that much, honestly. I just remember he was there for me during that difficult time. So I guess the reason why I pointed that out is if you're listening out there, yeah, who wasn't in your life? And typically, again, I wanted to do that for someone else. You wanted to pass that because it meant so much to you as well. Chris, you kind of talked, towards the end of the book, you talked about some of the practical things and what this sage might look like. So I want to talk about some of those. Number one, you talked about just this settled contentment. And I want to talk about that, like, because that's something that I think, I talk to a lot of business owners and just that word of being content. We're always striving for something, and then we reach this certain time, and again, we're entering this second half of life, and we're still not content. So maybe we try to climb another mountain. Maybe that's gonna do it for us. And the word "settled" sometimes like, "Well, I never want to settle," right?
Yeah.
So can you talk to us about this, like this word of why you went down that road of the sage settled contentment?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think when we think about the word content, just like you said, there is, let me just put it this way. Contentment doesn't have a number attached to it. There's not a certain number that is in a bank account or a certain number of successes or a certain number of first, second, third place. Like there's not a number associated with contentment. Contentment and even the word enough, right? Do you have enough? Am I enough? Am I man enough? Like all that, what is enough? That's not the categories that we're talking about here. The contentment is not something external. We will not receive contentment from something external. Contentment has to be, and all the things I talk about in Sage are internal, which is why this is a shift, an important shift from the season of being that warrior where you're kind of conquering the hills and fighting battles and the king of like sitting on the throne and ruling your domain. There is a significant shift into the sage because he no longer has the need to prove himself, to conquer anything, to be bigger, to be stronger. Like all of those things, there is a settling inside of him that comes to a place of like, I can be well. And we read this in the ancient church fathers and mothers. We read this in all kinds of literature. We read this in scriptural. There is a sense of like, I can be well with whatever I have or don't have. It is not a matter of my possessions. It is a matter of what possesses me. And so the settled contentment, I talk about that in the sense of like, when I was a boy, I had to be pretty scrappy. And I had to be pretty scrappy to make my own way and do my own thing and meet my own needs. And a sage who moves into the settled contentment space recognizes how scrappy he's had to be and then allows for that, inner child, if you will, that younger part of him, that story of who he was, to take a rest. And he doesn't have to be scrappy anymore because he doesn't have to go after those things anymore. And the phrasing that I like to use with the first and second passage is if the task of the first passage is to find the man within the boy and call him forth. Mm-hmm. The task of the second passage is to find the boy within the man and bring him home. Mm-hmm. Bring him home to that settledness, that scrappy boy that I had to be, that you had to be, that many of us, like, to let him come home in a way that like he gets to rest now. He doesn't have to prove anything anymore. So that is what I mean by settled contentment. And Brett, it takes work
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
It takes work to do that because it's this internal shift, this internal posture that we need to find, and it's some elements of your story, it's some elements of where you've had to be, it's some elements of even how you've had to be throughout your life, like doing some work in that to go, what if there is are some other ways?
Mm.
What if there are some other ways of me being, that can lead me to a place of contentment? But when you think about, sages in your life, and I think whether it's, the guy that you met in college or Ben or any of these fictional characters that I've talked about, right? There is a sense of like they have a sense of settledness about them. Just think about when Luke first finds Yoda. He's in a hovel somewhere on a far and distant planet, and all he's concerned about is, stew.
Mm.
And Luke is all spun out about all the things and the battles and all those kinds of things. And Yoda just has this contentment. And I think that's part of the presence that we can bring as sages to the world. It's like, I have nothing more that I need to prove.
Mm.
I can be with you. And man, if I need to fight, I can fight for sure. I know how to do that. And we see sages do that too. And we don't have to.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by settled contentment.
I love that. And I was really digging into just when you talked about bringing the boy home, bringing the boy back into the man. So again, somewhere if we've lost that childlikeness, right? Obviously, what Christ talks about, just to be like the child. And when I think about even my own children, he talked about, again, kind of bringing that back into the presence. It's just they're always present, right? They're always in the moment. They're always present. They're not thinking about or worried about a lot of stuff. They're just in the present and just kind of bringing that together. And that's why, even at our events, like, I mean, I just want to bring out some of that boyishness, some of that childlikeness. Let's just have some fun. Let's play. And,
Yes.
and is that some of the things that you're kind of talking about that men just kind of lose along the way? Because we wake up and we're like, oh, I have all this stuff I have to do and to think about and to manage. So
yeah, I think most of a man's life is the accumulation of problems.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is not just like problems like relationship problems, but I have a new car, I have a new toy, I have a new house, I have a new grill, whatever it is that I have to tend to. Now I have more problems because I have more stuff. And so I think what you're talking about definitely is like bringing us back to some place of that childlikeness and playfulness for sure. But also below that is I want to honor some of the work I'm talking about too, is I want to honor what that scrappy boy had to do to provide for his own needs.
Mm.
Given that family of origin scenario, he did well. He made it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not all of the choices that he made along the way were the best ones. Maybe they led them into, brokenness or sinfulness or addiction or whatever it is. And like, I want to honor the choices that he made at that time and kind of say, hey, if I'm having a conversation, even the psalmist has conversations with his own soul, like, why so downcast, oh my soul? Why so disturbed within me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have those conversations with myself all the time. Just be like, hey, like, why are you anxious right now? Little Chris inside of me, why are you anxious right now? And what can we do differently than go towards the scrappiness or towards the addiction or towards the things like, how can we find alternate ways to be? Come home. Like, let's just rest.
Mm.
That's what I mean by that too.
Amen.
So I love that you bring in just, how Jesus like admonishes the disciples and he says, no, let the little children come.
Mm-hmm.
For as you become like them, you enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think that is so important for us, that as we grow into this manhood that is supposed to not at all be childlike or not at all be weak or whatever, like, no, it's more when we attend to those younger parts of us that we come closer to the kingdom of heaven.
Amen. Thanks, Chris. A couple other things just to kind of to go on. So we talked about settled contentment as a characteristic of the sage.
Yeah.
And I love when you talk about inner hospitality, kind of maybe went in a couple of stories about maybe we're not very hospitable in your own story, in your own experience with when people have brought you in for something. But you talk about this inner hospitality. Can you talk about that? Like, what does that exactly mean with when it comes to
Yeah.
this?
Well, so just the word hospitality, like think about when you have people uh, over to your house. You're welcoming them into your home. You're creating space for them to be. You've maybe thought about which meal you're going to serve. You thought about, how it's going to be, what room you're going to sit in, that kind of stuff. All right. So hospitality, if we can think about that, is just the creating of space. Well, if you have inside of you no space, if you're constantly full of thoughts and worries, and you're listening to someone and you're always thinking like, what am I going to say next? Or how am I going to respond? Or what story am I going to share? Like that, there's no space for that other person to just be.
Mm,
And so inner hospitality in my mind is like this inside of you. Is there enough space for you to be back to settled and content, for you to sit down? But then is there space for someone else to be present, to where you're not constantly running off to the next thing or thinking about the next thing? One quick example with that is just the other day, I was on the phone. My daughter is doing a documentary film. And so I was helping her do some research. And I called up this guy that we were thinking about, talking to and asking. He's, in his 70s. And I was on the phone, Brett, for about 45 minutes. And I think I had maybe 20 words that I could offer.
mm.
And I wanted to ask questions, but he wouldn't even listen to my questions. And so like I got off the phone and I'm like, there's no inner hospitality in this man, because he filled the entire space.
Yeah.
He filled the phone call with himself. And so what we need, and I think in order to bring that presence, is we need to be hospitable to other people. And that starts first with us. Do we have space inside of us? But then can we invite other people into like, where are you, and how would you like to be together right now? Come sit down and let me just be with you, because I, again, don't have anything to prove to you. So that's what I mean by inner hospitality.
I love it. That's awesome. I love that. Just to make space. And I think especially in our modern world, and the guys I talk to, we don't leave space. We don't have space in our minds. We think maybe we're even resting, but we're still thinking about something. We're still listening to something. We're still doing something. And it's just spinning, and we never make space for even our own self, let alone for someone else to make space for them. So thanks for pointing that out. Let's just talk about one more.
Sure.
You talk about generous spirituality. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that? Like what does that mean when you put generous before that?
Well, in my younger years as a believer, I was a zealot. I mean, I was going after it. I wanted to learn all the information and have all the black and white categories of truth and not truth and right and wrong, and all of that. And I was voracious in my reading and in my learning. And I had, theology systematized, right? Everything had its place. And then, Brett, like I went into missions and I moved overseas, and I experienced a totally different way of understanding God and myself and the world. And it's not that anything shifted in my core theology, but some significant things shifted in my understanding of belief and belonging and church and engagement of community and the individual versus the group. Like all of that kind of stuff began to shift inside of me. And I was recognizing like how I was trained as a person in ministry, as a missionary, wasn't actually working where I lived and with the people that I was wanting to reach and introduce to faith. They were coming in a totally different way. They were coming, but they were coming from a totally different path. And it was far more, I'll give a brief example. Like I was trained, you have to believe before you belong. That you had to kind of make some faith statement before you then belonged to our community. You had to be right before you could belong. And I found in the context that I was living in that it was far the opposite, that it was much more important for people to belong wherever they were, whatever their perspectives were, whatever their spirituality was, their religion, their sexuality, whatever it was that they were. It was more important for us to say, hey, you are welcome here and you can belong with us and to us, and we will consider you one of us, because there's no us and them anymore. There's no right and wrong. There is just the community. Come belong. And then what I was noticing is that as they belong, they began to believe.
Wow.
And so when I talk about generous spirituality, there is a sense of like, hey, it is not my task anymore to make sure that you have right and wrong clearly identified, and that you believe what is right and you don't believe what is wrong, or that you are black or white or in or out or us or them or any of those kinds of things. But that you have my task is to bring a sense of welcome, a sense of generosity, a sense of presence. And just as Jesus does, like, I will sit at the table with whomever else will sit at the table with me.
Amen.
And I will share a cup and share a meal and share a conversation and share friendship and joy and companionship with whomever will be there in the sense of generosity. And I will still hold who I am and what I believe, and allow for us to be together at the same table. And through that relational kind of style of engagement, that is, I think, something that a sage, a generously spiritual person has. Come be. And as we are together, we will discover where we're going.
That's awesome. Oh man, I love this. This is just amazing. This is an amazing book, guys. You got to check out Sage, A Man's Guidance into His Second Passage. And I think one of my final questions is, Chris, this is awesome. He also said this is a journey. This takes a lot of work. It's a never-ending journey, right? Just because this isn't something someone's going to listen to this information and be like, oh, I'm going to do everything that you just said. I'm going to go out and do that. So can you talk about what type of work can men do to become, because I think most of the people listening to this, they want to be that, they have that desire, but they get lost, they're tripped up, they don't know how, and they kind of give up sometimes, and they're just yo-yo, right? They're like, okay, I'm going to do it, but it's too hard. Can you talk about some of the men that you've worked with, like the work that men put into this on a daily basis?
Well, I'm going to start where you started, and that is that it's a journey. Okay. You can't summit a mountain without first starting, taking your first few steps right out of the car at the trailhead. So you have to just get out of the car. And I think some of it is having a couple categories. First is you will do far better in any journey of a man, whether you are raising your boys or girls or whatever, or becoming a sage, if you have other men with you. And just the other day, I was talking with a friend of mine, and we've got some things that we're working on in the area of interviewing a guy around his forge and his metal making. And one of the things he said was that strength comes from the forging, sharpness comes from the other iron. So we talk about iron sharpening iron. We need other men to sharpen us, but strength comes far before you can even sharpen. The metal itself, the forging of the metal, the melting of the metal, that is something that no one else can do for you. But it's helpful to have a company of men, a collection of men, a cadre of guys that you are living life with, who are journeying through similar types of life stage. And so that gets into the brotherhood book, which is a whole other conversation. But so the first is, who are the guys that you can be with? The second is, you need a guide. You need someone. And this is someone like you, Brett. This is someone like a counselor. This is someone maybe like a coach, a sage. But don't expect the guide to do the work for you. The guide is just there to help you know, maybe what some of the next steps might be. but you need a guide.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think establishing some good rhythms for yourself. We are the only creatures on earth, humans are the only creatures on earth that have the capacity for reflection. And so when we offer ourselves the space for reflection, it's important for us to take it. So journal, talk, sit and stare at a river going by and think, just reflect over your life and begin to do some of that reflection. And in the book, I've got some reflection questions and some journey that you can go through. So there is some of that offered there, but just like taking up the space, whether you're a journaler or not, whether you talk things out or write things out, reflect. That I think is the number one thing to get out of the car and start walking up that trail towards the sage. And then, get involved in some things. Come to some of the things that you, Brett, are offering. You guys come to the things that Brett is offering, and come, we do some similar things at Restoration Project. Come to some of those. In January, I am taking a group, and this is open now for registration if you want to join us. I'm taking a group of men to Scotland for a sage experience journey, where we're going to talk about these categories of what does it mean to step into these places, like do some things like that.
That's awesome.
Step into some of those places. So those would be the first things. And then I think the final thing is allow yourself to take the time that you need, because you didn't become a man overnight. You're not going to become a sage overnight. Yeah. And so just allow for it to be a journey that you're on. And in that kind of journey, it's going to be, one step at a time, one piece at a time, one story at a time, one process at a time. And just keep moving. Just keep moving. Don't lose sight of where you're headed, because where you currently are feels like it's a little rough.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your feedback and wisdom, Chris. I appreciate you so much just with your time of our audience today. Where's the best place for someone to get Sage, a man's guide into his second passage, or any of your other books, or even to check out Restoration Project?
Sure. Well, so all the books are online on Amazon. So just hop on Amazon. That's probably the best place to get it. Just search for Sage and my name, and you should be able to find it. But then also, if you're interested in getting just the first chapter, to check out any of the books that I have in any of the first chapters, you want to just kind of dip your toe into the water first, you can go to restorationproject.net/first chapter, all one word. And you can download the first chapter of any of the books there. So those would probably be the best places to find us. And then if you're looking for a guide, if you're looking for someone to walk with you, restory.life is the counseling center that we have. And we do work with people all around the world. So check us out at restory.life as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to put that in our show notes too, guys. So check that out on our website, irondeep.com. And it's a wrap with Chris Bruno. Thanks so much, Chris. God bless you, brother.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brett.